John B. Alexander svakako je zanimljiva osoba. Taj umirovljeni pukovnik američke vojske od kasnih 70-ih bavi se iskustvima bliskih smrti, na čemu je i doktorirao na Sveučilištu Walden, a mentorica mu je bila slavna psihijatrica Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. U vojnim i obavještajnim krugovima bio je jedan od najeksponiranijih zagovornika uključivanja američke vlade u istraživanje paranormalnih fenomena, u rasponu od savijanja žlica umom do remote viewinga. Radio je na projektu Jedi Warrior, kojemu je bio cilj poboljšati sposobnosti vojnika pomoću neurolingvističkog programiranja. Napisao je knjige o NLO-ima, šamanizmu, remote viewingu. Organizirao je i predsjedao nad 6 velikih konferencija o nesmrtonosnom oružju, ali mnogima će ime Johna B. Alexandera biti poznato iz filma Muškarci koji bulje u koze, gdje je postao lik u filmu i knjizi koja je prethodila filmu. Jedno je sigurno, John B. Alexander cijeloga se života već nalazio ovdje, na rubu znanosti. Gospodine Alexander, dobar dan.
Good evening.
Ovdje smo da bismo porazgovarali o svim neobičnim iskustvima i susretima iz graničnih područja ljudskog znanja koje ste doživjeli tijekom vaše vojne karijere i poslije. Možda možemo početi sa temom parapsihologije koja je bila popularna 60-ih i 70-ih godina kada su bili u nekakvom središtu interesa svi ti paranormalni fenomeni. Kada ste vi osobno imali prvi kontakt s tim fenomenima i na koji način je sve to počelo u Americi, u SSR-u, koji je vaš doprinos u tome?
My personal interest was, well, actually, it goes back when I was very, very young. I gave my first, I went to an unusual grade school and actually did my first broadcast on UFOs when I was 10 years old. So that would have been 1947.
Tada ste odrasli. Što se tada zbivalo? Stupili ste naravno u vojsku i u nekim vremenima ste bili uključeni u istraživanja paranormalnih pojava. Zna se danas da je impuls na zapadu došao od onih svih informacija da se u SSSR-u radi na istraživanja paranormalnih istraživanja. Što je bio zapravo pravi poticaj prvi prema vašem sjećanju da se započnu istraživanja paranormalnih pojava u Americi?
Well, now, first I had a personal interest, and so these were things that I followed anyway. And then we were quite aware that the Soviet Union was studying and employing various kinds of psychic phenomena as well. So on one side we were watching what they were doing, and the other we started doing experiments. And particularly when, the remote viewing aspect, which you might know colloquially as psychic spying, if you will. But we also learned the psychokinesis works, the metal bending. You probably know of Uri Geller, and it was modeled on some of the things he did. But what we found was you could teach everybody how to do this. And so we were actually researching and finding out what the limits were.
Mm-hmm. What was done in Soviet Union back then that you were aware of? What types of experiments and what results were made?
Oh, the ones where there was a book called Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, and that was a very popular book and discussed many of the topics. But what we were seeing in classified literature was that, yes, indeed, these experiments were going on. So it included use of psychics to gain information. There were people who could move things, again, the psychokinesis kinds of things, interested in that. We had a defector from the KGB who came out and told some very interesting stories about being able to actually kill animals using psychic approach. So that particularly was of concern.
Koja je razlika između postignuća remote viewinga i ograničenja te tehnike? Znači, koji je zapravo bio pravi špijunski učinak i mogućnosti promatranja i dobivanja informacija iz daljine s obzirom na taj odnos signala i šuma koji se uvijek pojavljuje kod takvih istraživanja?
Well, the question that arose quickly was, who can do remote viewing and what's the best approach? The Soviet approach was to go out in the public and find people with natural abilities. Our question was, do we do that, or do you find people from the intelligence community and you can train them to do those sorts of things? And most of ours was the latter. We went with people who had had unique experiences, but were from in the intelligence community itself, and then the cell was very, very small of the people who were working on it. Now, we also had two different types. One was a research, which was done out at Stanford Research Institute that I think they know about, and the other was operational, actually going against various targets of interest.
Što se tiče vaših iskustava sa remote viewingom ili jasno videocima ili kako se to već naziva gledanjem na daljinu, kakvi su bili rezultati svih tih napora? Poznato je da su mnogi remote vieweri napisali knjige o svojim iskustvima, naravno te knjige su više ili manje vjerodostojne. Prema vašem iskustvu, dokle se stiglo u tim istraživanjima?
Well, it's like everything else. We had some people who were very good, but like everything else in the intelligence community, you don't rely on one tiny piece. You put the information together and see what the picture looks like. Now, there's a very famous case that's been published on Joe McMoneagle, who was remote viewer 001, if you've read In the Field. And specifically, looking for submarines. What happened was we had a satellite photo of a big building, and nobody could figure out what the building was. And so they asked him, could he see inside the building? And so he did this, and he says, well, there are several submarines. One of them is very, very large. It is very different because the missiles are forward of the sail. It is double-hulled. There's a number of other technologies that he saw. And he said in 6 months, there'll be a channel where you can go out and, they'll be able to float the boat out. Now, the information turned out to be very accurate. But the analysis was, they didn't believe it because our boat builders said, if you build a submarine that big, if you go down to depth, it'll crush. Well, it turns out the Soviets had done it, and a little later the clouds parted, and there was the Typhoon-class submarine, the first time we'd ever seen it. And all of the things that Joe had said were going to be new were in fact there.
Popričamo sad o telekinezi ili psihokinezi. Jeste li osobno vidjeli neke psihokinetičke učinke i izbliza, dakle, ljude koji su možda mogli savijati žlice ili vilice?
Oh, well, I used to teach psychokinesis. Obviously, Uri Geller, who was a very famous person who was known for metal bending and whatnot. A friend of mine from Jack Houck, who had been at McDonnell Douglas at the time, developed a process whereby we could teach people how to do that. And I learned that from him, and we were very impressed. The very first party we had was at my house. We called them PK parties. And a young woman, a friend of ours, is holding forks like this, and this one just dropped over. And right in front of my boss, who was the commanding general of the Intelligence and Security Command, we went, wow, wait a minute, this really works. And so we started using it, but not to bend things, mostly to influence our commanders. It's one of the problems you had. We had been blindsided several times with advances that we hadn't seen coming. And yet, when you look back, the information was there. So the point to the commanders in the intelligence community was, just because you don't believe it, don't discard evidence. And this is one that changed their belief system, because when they came in, they didn't believe they could bend it. There they were seeing this happen.
In what way you can learn to, let's say, bend the spoons or any other psychokinesis?
Yeah. Well, there was a very simple process, and it took about an hour to teach people, and it would create energy outside and bring it down and put it into the spoon. There were two things that were really important. One was the intention, getting of what you want to have happen, bending in particular, and the other is emotion, because we found when you're doing, that's why they call them parties, you get people excited, and it was in that process that you actually saw the best bending take place.
Was there any military purpose that came out of these psychokinesis experiments?
Well, as I said, most of it was information saying don't disregard things, trying to understand the limits of belief systems. And the other, I used to get asked, are you going to bend tank barrels? And you say, well, that's ridiculous. No. But if you remember, we're talking 1980s. Computers are just coming along, and we're relying more and more heavily. Now, if I can just make computers unreliable, that is a huge step forward. So that was the area that we were interested in, was, what can you do with moving electrons as opposed to moving heavy metal objects?
I read that you were some kind of friend with Uri Geller. Is that true?
Yeah, he's a personal friend.
Today, Uri Geller is, of course, very famous on one side,
right.
And on the other side, he is by lots of people so-called exposed as some kind of fraud, but in fact, he really did some effects. What were your personal experiences with Uri Geller, some extreme?
Well, my personal experiences, I have seen him do things that can't happen. And I described this to a magician who is one of the major debunkers, if you will. And what happened is we were in the U.S. Capitol itself, and he was talking, and not about bending. His interest there was the plight of the Soviet Jews, being unable to get out of Russia in particular. And so they said, bend. So he got a spoon, which he held like this. It came out of a guard's coffee cup, so it wasn't, I have a spoon in my pocket, and we'll do it. And he came like that, not like this. If you've got both fingers, it's probably faked, but too bad we don't have one. But he came like that, and the spoon bent like this, and then he put it on the back of the chair and went on talking, and the spoon kept bending without him touching it. So I've seen him bend many, many things. That was the most spectacular, and we were sitting at about this distance.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen him doing something bigger than just bending? Some bigger objects moving or something like this?
Well, bigger, yeah, I actually have a picture of a titanium tennis racket that he bent. Now, that's bent like this, not like this. But we tried bending that racket and had it tested, and I don't care how strong you are, you're not going to bend the titanium racket.
What happened, or how it happened, that you became a character in the movie?
Became what?
You a character in the movie that's about staring at the goats. In that movie, some character is based on you. You know that movie, People Who Stare at Goats.
I'm sorry, I've lost something here.
You know that movie, People Who Stare at Goats?
Oh, man.
So how happened that you were part of this film in any way?
Well, the problem with The Men Who Stare at Goats is that the author, John Ronson, he took about this much truth, and he wrote this much, and then they made the movie. And in fact, on my website, I have explained what's real and what's not. First of all, no goats ever died from staring at them. That's a story that's not related to any truth. Goats did die. The experiments had to do with dim mak, which is a martial arts, the death touch. But in the movie, they discussed several things. Of course, remote viewing was real. Cloud busting, yeah, we tried that. The spoon bending, Kevin Spacey bends one, and obviously we just discussed that. So there were a number of small aspects that were true, but the way the movie, I mean, it was a comedy.
Evo, držim u ruci vašu knjigu NLO-i, mitovi, zavjere i stvarnosti. Kako je vaše mišljenje o tom fenomenu koji je u 20. stoljeću bio dosta dominantan i zapravo je toliko širok i toliko neobuhvatljiv? Dokle ste vi došli u vašim razmišljanjima i istraživanjima?
Well, the first line of my book is UFOs are real. Now, the last paragraph says, whatever this is, it is more complex than we ever imagined and maybe that we could imagine. And the problem is, what do you mean by a UFO? We have little balls of light that fly around, and then in other places we have huge craft more than a mile across, seen by lots and lots of people that are physical, and everything in between. And the problem to me is the variability. There are so many different kinds of UFOs that are seen that, you know, little gray guys coming from Zeta Reticuli just doesn't make sense as an answer. So it's very, very complex.
On the public point, let's say, after Blue Book, American US Air Force just disbanded this problem.
Right.
But what was in fact inside stand of US military about UFOs? Because we heard on disclosure that there were problems with nuclear rockets and everything else. So how did the military really feel about UFOs then and now?
When I was in the Pentagon, I ran around looking for the guy that says the Pentagon says this and the Pentagon says that. The Pentagon doesn't say anything. It is made up by lots of people. And they have, like across the civilian population, a wide variety of beliefs. You have some who were true believers. I mentioned one story in there that I had interviewed a former 3-star general, head of one of the intelligence agencies, and he said, oh, we don't have a requirement to do that, but I'll tell you about the ones I saw. So here was a person who had personal experience, the head of an agency that still says we don't have an institutional responsibility. Now, in the book, I differentiate between individual interest and institutional interest, and they can be very, very different.
Znate li za neke slučajeve da su se NLO-i rušili, pa da su prikupljani, pa da je na temelju tih ostataka rađen reverzibilni inženjering?
Yeah, I come down against that. I have not found any evidence that supports it. Roswell is, of course, the classic case, if you will. In the book, I forget the numbers, but there are dozens of reported crashes, and you can find, 100 or so bodies and so many live aliens. But when you track the stories down, it just pretty much dissipates.
So you haven't met any military officer that had some experience of that kind?
To the best of my knowledge, no.
Okay. No. What about human contacts with so-called extraterrestrial? Of course, we cannot know, are they extraterrestrial, inside terrestrial, interdimensional, whatever. But when we are talking about human contacts with these beings that may be really in some of these UFOs of this really craft type, not, light ball type. Do you think that there is any firm ground for that statement?
Well, when I lecture, I mention that there have been reports of contacts between humans and sentient non-human entities throughout human history. This is millennia. And now adding UFOs to that is just one other wrinkle on it. Hard to say. The stories are hard to dismiss and hard to rectify because there is no common theme. It goes back to the UFOs themselves. Why do you have this wide variability? Why do we have the reports for centuries to millennia of people interacting with different kinds of beings? This is something we just have yet to figure out. That's why I say the phenomena is more complex than we can imagine.
Vaš stav je sličan zaključku astrofizičara Jacquesa Valléa koji je u jednoj od svojih knjiga rekao da su možda suvremeni susreti s takozvanim izvanzemljanima zapravo susreti s onim istim bićima koje su naši preci u neka davna vremena nazivali patuljcima, vilama. Znači, ovdje se u stvari govori o nekom drugačijem poimanju stvarnosti, koje dolazi do nas kroz ta takozvana anomalna iskustva. Koja su ta anomalna iskustva i te anomalije koje šire priču sa NLO-a na poimanje svijeta i kakva je po vama priroda svijeta ako su ta iskustva stvarna?
Well, I wish I knew. One of my comments is that when we started studying this form of consciousness, it is at least as complex as cancer. And yet the amount of research that's done in it is very, very small. And I think we need to apply the best and brightest minds on it. We don't do that. I mean, the short answer is don't know. But I think it's worth exploring because there's no doubt about the reality, the physical reality now of some of these things. They're not delusions or hallucinations or anything like that. We have enough with physical evidence involved.
Jeste li imali priliku kada vidjeti takozvane usadke ili implante koje se često povezuju sa otmicama i sa NLO-ima?
I have heard of many of these. Roger Lear, who had taken them out, again, a personal friend. I have not seen any that are convincing.
Pričali smo o telepatiji, o telekineziji i svim tim fenomenima koje nam govore nešto o stvarnosti svijetu što još ne znamo. Bilo je naravno i pokušaja da se uđe u trak kroz znanstvene eksperimente tim fenomenima. Jedan od pionira na tom području bio je Cliff Baxter. Vi ste također surađivali neko vrijeme s njim. Kakve ste eksperimente radili?
Yeah, no, Cleve was, again, a personal friend. We hired him because he was the one that found out that plants could communicate. Accidentally, by the way. His experiment started, he's the guy who developed the polygraph system in the United States. And he had a big philodendron and he put the GSR things on the leaf, and the question was, if I pour water on the roots, how long does it take the water to get to the plants? And he timed that, but he just left it hooked up, and he noticed that periodically they were getting recordings, and they goes like, why? Tried to find out what's the relationship between the plant and this recording, and they found out that it was human emotions. And so then he started with simple things like, I'll rip the leaf, and the plant would send out a signal. Then he found that he could burn the leaf, and it would send out a signal. And so then he said he would hold the lighter and say, I'm thinking about burning the leaf, and the plant would. And they go, now how can the plant respond to a thought? So he moved. Actually, he came out and announced the findings. In America, it was just disregarded totally. It was picked up in Eastern Europe. There were researchers here who were quite interested in the field. So then he moved on, and we started looking at oral leukocytes, the white cells in the mouth. And we found you could put leukocytes in a little container with electrodes in it, put this in a Faraday cage, totally secure, and this goes through some sophisticated devices, and then it's recording. And now, obviously, the person and the leukocytes are not attached, but you could follow the emotional state of the person who had donated the cells, and when they got excited, the cells were actually sending out a signal. And we did some very sophisticated experiments, some of which I was one of the test subjects. We did that and put me on the polygraph, and I found I could beat the polygraph, but not the white cells.
S obzirom na vašu vojnu karijeru i vaša sudjelovanje u istraživanjima paranormalnih fenomena, neobično je što ste se našli i u istraživanju takozvanih iskustava bliskih smrti. Čak ste napravili i doktorat na tu temu. Na koji način ste se našli u toj temi i što u stvari mislite o njima?
Just before, when I was finishing my PhD, my doctorate, Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, who is the person who brought hospice to the United States, we met, and she became the head of my committee. But she and Raymond Moody were the ones interested in near-death experience, and so we were hearing these stories that had been anecdotes that were kept in families. But it was very, very compelling kinds of information. So I got involved, later became the president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies.
Vi ste i doktorirali na temu iskustava bliskih smrti. Koji je bio vaš pristup u doktoratu?
The dissertation was on her workshop, and it was on changes in spirituality in people who attended her workshops. She had one called Life, Death, and Transition. And what we found was that people who were exposed to this information had very substantial changes in their belief system, and surprisingly, it kept on expanding. Usually you have this and you have a euphoric artifact, which is, people feel high at the end of a workshop and drop off. But when we looked farther out, we found it was having a more profound impact the longer you waited after the exposure. But I was exposed to me. She told some very remarkable stories.
Koje je vaše osobno mišljenje o iskustvima bliskim smrti? Jesu li to stvarna iskustva? Jesu li kao iskustva stvarna, ali zapravo nestvarna po pitanju stvarnosti našeg svijeta? Je li to možda tek neki trik uma?
My personal belief is this is a very profound area that is worthy of discussion. A problem with most near-death experience, you don't know if the person was close to death or not. Accidents, illness, or whatnot. There are a subset of cases in which the individual was instrumented, and we absolutely know they were dead. There are others in which the incident happened and say they acquired information that could not be acquired by any other rational means and yet proves to be true. Another subset I'm interested in ones in which a spontaneous healing takes place. I had one where a young woman died. She got sent to the morgue. She gets up and starts doing ballet after it. The point was she was a paraplegic when she died, and now her legs are working and everything. So you get these very few, very remarkable cases, but it fits with what we know that maybe 8% of the population have had that are older. We looked at Gallup over people over 18, so they've had a chance to be close to death. And when you look at it, it ends up in millions and millions of cases. Most of them are interesting, hard to determine, but some of them just defy description.
Tijekom istraživanja smrti i svih tih fenomena vezanih uz smrt, jeste li se nekad susreli sa fenomenom transplantacije organa, kod kojeg kao da se neke osobine zapravo sa jedne osobe koja je umrla presele na onu kojoj je taj organ transplantiran?
Well, there's two sorts. One, I think what you're talking about there is for the organ transplant. Is that it? Yeah. Gary Schwartz is the one who's done most of the work on that, but it's very interesting that people who have had heart transplants, lung transplants or something, and after it they suddenly are interested in new kinds of food, remember things that didn't happen in their life but did happen in the lives of the donor. Certainly says that there's some kind of something goes into the organ itself that is actually a memory that can be then transmitted and evoked by the recipient.
Tijekom 20. stoljeća fenomen razmišljanja zapravo o postojanju pretpotopnih civilizacija nekako uzeo maha i 70. godina došlo do zanimljivog otkrića u kojem ste zapravo na neki način baš u to vrijeme i vi bili blizu. Riječ je o cesti Bimini, odnosno nizu megalita na dnu oceana, za koje se još danas raspravlja jesu li prirodnog ili umjetnog podrijetla. Vi ste također tamo ronili.
This is very, very, very controversial, but off of Bimini they have what they call the Bimini Wall, which is about 1,800 meters long. And the point was, when we dived on it, we were doing free diving, so it's not very deep, maybe 10 meters or so the most. But you have these very large megalithic rocks lined up in perfect order. And it goes on for this long area. And the point was, when you would swim on the outside, you would say, this is ocean floor. All of you cross it, here's this line of megaliths, and then on the other side, nothing. Some will suggest that that's just a natural formation of beach rock. I don't know now. At the time, it certainly looked very, very different. And I've got pictures of very large rocks, very specifically, I mean, it looks like it was definitely man-made. But an area worth thinking, the antediluvian world is certainly an area of interest.
Zadnjih godina našli ste i u istraživanju komunikacije sa dupinima, odnosno to je dio šireg istraživanja komunikacije između vrsta. Ronili ste s dupinima, na neki način pokušavali ostvariti komunikaciju. Je li to bilo uspješno? Dokle ste stigli? Kako su iskustva na tom polju?
Well, we were working with telepathic communication. This was involved with a former wife. The experiment that we did, two sorts of experiments. Some were in tanks where you have them contained, and the other in the wild, off of Bimini again, where we're working with a pod. So the dolphins there were free to come and go, and dolphins over a day will normally traverse, say, 200 miles. And they eat a lot of food. The pods split up, they eat, and they come back. And so we had called them in. The protocol said we don't touch, they have to initiate contact. And when they came in, they would swim very close. I mean, like within an inch of you, they would swim up, pretty exciting. But then we also had tried to direct them and were successful in saying, okay, go in this direction, now turn around and come back. So you're changing, on command, the area of the direction that they're going and have them come back and then turn and go off again. At least anecdotally, quite successful.
Mm-hmm. How long have you been participating in that swimming with the dolphins?
Well, that we did a lot of years ago. As you know, I am just back from the Kingdom of Tonga. In this case, instead of dolphins, we're working with humpback whales, which is very, very dramatic, but we're talking about distances in maybe a few feet to inches from something that big. And they seemed to know exactly where we were. And that was okay. They would divert. One of the things we did, we would have the calving area, and the mothers would be very deep, and the calves would have to breathe more frequently, so they would come up, and we're hovering in the water right above them, and they would come up and would definitely miss us and come up. Now maybe that's sight, but that they would, be protective of us was kind of interesting. I hope to be able to go back and do some more exacting experiments there.
Do you feel that you really made some communications with whales or dolphins?
Well, with the dolphins, certainly. With the whales, I don't know yet. Again, I hope to be able to repeat those experiments within the next year or so.
Mm-hmm. Except your investigations, experiments with dolphins, can you tell us about other experiments with dolphins and what were results in trying to communicate?
Well, there's two sorts of experiments. Of course, Lilly on dolphins, and I had met John Lilly before. He's the one who really started this work, both with dolphins in captivity and in the wild, and found them to be quite responsive. Now, there's a whole other set of dolphin experiments, the military has done with them for, securing areas or being able to find mines or deactivate boats and things of that nature. So that's another, like I say, a whole nother set, and obviously the purpose in that is quite different. But they do work with and find you can obviously train dolphins quite well.
U vašoj biografiji se vidi da ste dosta putovali po svijetu i posjećivali razne tradicionalne i šamanističke kulture. Jeste li se susretili sa iscijeliteljima i sa tim iscjeljivanjima i to one vrste koje bi na zapadu bila smatrana nemogućim ili neobičnim?
Well, what you've just mentioned is something that's very important. In the West, particularly Europe and the United States, we look at these alternative hearings as strange or anomalous. That this is different, this is really wild. I do a lot of work in Brazil for the government, and this is in what I call the straight world area. The difference that you find in the intelligentsia of Brazil, senior officers, ministers, and that, they accept these things as normal. Whereas we see them as separate and different. So they incorporate it into their belief system. I'm going to be talking about how spirits interact, because I've dealt with shamans from around the world. And in other societies, this is just part and parcel of reality. Our problem is that our science has taken a materialistic view. If we cut things and make it smaller and smaller and smaller, we will get to the Higgs boson, the God particle, if you will. It does not account for the role of consciousness. And I think that we have missed a huge part of the total reality.
Jeste li imali prilike uživo gledati paranormalnu, takozvanu psihičku kirurgiju?
Well, there's several. You mentioned John of God, and we've been down in Abyssinia a couple of times. We're just there this year. Now, he does several types of surgery. Some of it is physical cutting and that, and other is spiritual or psychic surgery, and done sometimes at a distance. I had a case this year. I was interested in behalf of a woman who is the wife of a very famous writer in these areas who has a brain tumor, and took her picture down and said, okay, we would like to get healing. When I wrote back and I said, sent him an email and said, okay, we've just done the intervention, and the response was, she's feeling better than she has in months, that came back. When they did the fMRI, at least the tumor had not increased. I'm working with an individual now who using something called the Bankston method in particular, but we've seen several fairly dramatic shifts in, grade 4 cancer that disappears, and things of that nature. So it certainly happens.
Have you seen anything from that part of psychic surgery, some kind of actual operations with eyeballs, with stuff? Can you describe some of it?
Well, I've watched John of God, and one of the things he does, you mentioned, is scraping the eyeballs, which is, kind of, anytime you get near your eyes, you get kind of squeamish. But they believe that the eyes are the window to the soul. And we have had, dramatic response there. This comes from Spiritism, and a friend of mine is a retired Brazilian colonel, and I have a picture on the website where they're with his wife, who was totally bedridden and had gone to all of the traditional doctors who said, we can't fix your back. It was a back problem, and went into the church, and she's now up and around and totally mobile like you and I. So I've seen several of those cases that are really quite dramatic. The other question, however, and this is one that doesn't get asked, is why is it some people go to the same experience and have nothing happen? When I was in Abyssinia this year, I saw lots of people who came in wheelchairs and braces and things, and everybody who came in wheelchairs left in wheelchairs. Now, why is it that some people get healed and others don't? These are the kind of things I think we need to research much more thoroughly.
Dio polja vašeg istraživanja je i takozvani NLP, odnosno neurolingvistično programiranje. U nekim vašim knjigama opisivali ste kako su se te metode NLP-a pokušavale koristiti i koristile za usavršavanje vojničkih sposobnosti. Na koji način i dokle se stiglo?
Well, no, you've hit on a thing. NLP is actually a therapeutic modality. It was designed, if you will, to fix broken people. And what they had done, and I had both of the inventors under contract, Richard Bandler and John Grinder, and what they were doing is how do we take people who have various kinds of personal problems and make them whole again. Our question was, and this gets back to, you said in the military, we was especially studying it, we had very good people. I mean, our people were a cut above your normal soldiers. So the question was, how can I take good people and make them even better? So we started what we called the Jedi Project, and it was, can we find the skill? What we would do is take the best of the best and do basically a modeling. What is it that these people who excel in a specific skill, what is it they do? What are the critical path model, if you're familiar with that? Well, what are the instruments that have to work? Because you'd find they would have trappings on it, things that they would do. And so we would determine that, and we did this particularly with pistol shooting, and I was able to come up with a model where we could train people to shoot much faster and much better than the traditional model itself. We also took the people who were already experts and improved their skills. So,
organizirali ste i vodili nekoliko konferencija o takozvanim nesmrtonosnim oružjima, koja možda jesu nesmrtonosna, ali nisu ništa time manje neugodna. Što sve spada u nesmrtonosna oružja?
Very bluntly, are weapons that where you can apply force without killing people. Now, it does not mean you will never ever kill or not have some fatalities. One of the things I point out is that, balloons kill people as well. Kids' toys, there's nothing that you can't be misapplied. So the inference there is, what is the intent of the individual? But on the low end, there were things like pepper spray and pepper ball, tasers, water cannons, things of that nature, beanbag bullets, if you will, plastic bullets. On the high end, we were talking strategic incapacitation. How do I take a target set like a nation state and degrade the infrastructure in such a way that they can't continue conflict, but to do it in such a way that you can restore the infrastructure in relatively short order. And so it's a whole breadth of system.
Postoji li danas neka formulirana politika vezana uz nesmrtonosna oružja?
Oh, sure. That's, both the United States and Europe. I have lectured in Germany, where we've had these conferences every 2 years. So policies have been developed to say exactly what it is. I mean, we're talking volumes of material. Unfortunately, we have run into a lot of conflict. One of my major adversaries, or some of them, are International Committee of the Red Cross and Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, which tend to be against them. And my argument there is, compared to what? We know how to kill people. We can do that pretty efficiently. I think we ought to have other alternatives.
Gospodine Aleksandar, hvala vam na ovom razgovoru i želim vam sretan put gdje god vas on dalje vodio. Doviđenja.
Okay, thank you.